January 17th, 1945. Houffalize, Belgium. The snow crunches beneath German boots. A Wehrmacht sergeant, pale from frostbite and hunger, stumbles through the skeletal remains of what was once a crossroads village. The Battle of the Bulge has collapsed. His division, once 15,000 strong, now barely musters 800 gaunt faces. Behind him, abandoned panzers sit frozen in their tracks, not from enemy fire, but from empty fuel tanks. The sergeant clutches a piece of hardtack in his pocket, the last ration his company will see for 3 days. He squints westward through the fog, and there, rolling toward him like an iron tide, comes something he cannot comprehend. Not tanks, not infantry, trucks, hundreds of them. Thousands. An endless convoy stretching back beyond the horizon, each one laden with crates, barrels, ammunition boxes, and supplies stacked so high they seem to defy gravity. They move with mechanical precision, one every 40 seconds, day and night, through rain and mud and darkness. The sergeant stops walking, his mind shaped by years of rationing, of scavenging, of making do with nothing, cannot reconcile what his eyes are showing him. This is not an army. This is a nation on wheels. The German High Command had miscalculated many things about the Americans, but none so catastrophically as this. They had mistaken industrial capacity for soft character and logistics for luck. From the marble halls of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht in Berlin to the forward command posts dug into frozen Belgian soil, the understanding of American warfare was filtered through a prism of contempt. The Americans were seen as rich, yes, obscenely so, but untested, undisciplined, a mongrel force lacking the purity of purpose that defined the Wehrmacht or the fanaticism that drove the SS. They fought, the Germans believed, not from strength of spirit, but from an embarrassment of riches. Strip away their material advantage, deny them their supply lines, and they would crumble like the French had in 1940. This was the gamble Hitler placed on the snowy fields of the Ardennes in December 1944. Cut through their lines, seize their fuel depots at Liège, reach Antwerp, and the Americans would sue for peace. It was a fantasy built on desperation, but it was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding. The Americans did not fight despite their logistics. They fought because of it. Their supply chain was not a crutch, it was a philosophy. And nowhere was that philosophy more brutally demonstrated than in the Red Ball Express. The road network that snaked from the Normandy beaches to the German frontier was never meant to carry what it carried. These were country lanes, farm paths, centuries-old cobblestone routes designed for horses and carts, not 10-ton GMC trucks loaded with artillery shells and aviation fuel. Yet from August 1944 to November 1945, the Red Ball Express turned those roads into the most vital artery of the European theater. Named after railroad terminology for express freight service, the Red Ball was a one-way loop. Trucks moved forward loaded with supplies, returned empty, reloaded, and repeated the cycle without rest. At its peak, the system moved over 12,000 tons of supplies per day across nearly 600 miles. 6,000 vehicles, driven by men who had not been trained as logistics specialists but as soldiers, clerks, mechanics, many of them African-American troops from segregated quartermaster battalions, men who would be denied a seat at a lunch counter back home, but were now entrusted with the lifeblood of the Allied advance. They drove without headlights through the blackout, navigating by memory and instinct. They drove through air raids, through sniper fire, through roads cratered by artillery. They drove until the trucks fell apart, then cannibalized parts from the wrecks to keep the convoy moving. The Germans had nothing like it. They never had, and by 1945, they never would. What the Germans expected was a different kind of war. They had grown accustomed to fighting enemies who bled when cut, who faltered when their supply depots burned, who could be starved into submission. The Eastern Front had taught them that Soviet logistics were a matter of heroic improvisation. Soldiers marching hundreds of miles on foot, eating from the land, dying by the thousands, not from bullets, but from cold and hunger. The British, efficient but overstretched, rationed their ammunition and fuel with an accountant's precision. Even the French, before their collapse, had fought a war shaped by scarcity. But the Americans? The Americans arrived in Europe with a different arithmetic. They did not ration, they saturated. A single American infantry division consumed 600 tons of supplies per day. An armored division needed 1,000. Multiply that across 50 divisions advancing simultaneously, and the scale becomes incomprehensible. The Wehrmacht, fighting on 3 fronts, struggled to feed its soldiers black bread and watery soup. American mess tents served steak, canned peaches, fresh bread, and coffee so plentiful that soldiers poured it into their helmets to wash their socks. This was not decadence, this was doctrine. The U.S. Army had calculated that a well-fed, well-armed soldier fought longer, pushed harder, and died less often. Logistics was not a support function, it was the strategy. The Red Ball Express became operational on August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated. By then, the Allied advance had outrun its supply lines by 300 miles. Patton's Third Army was stalled outside Metz, not because the Germans had stopped him, but because his tanks had no fuel. Eisenhower faced a brutal choice: prioritize Montgomery's push north into Holland or Patton's drive east toward the Rhine. Either way, the supplies had to move, and the ports of Normandy, still the only major logistics hubs, were 500 miles behind the front. The Red Ball was improvised out of necessity, a masterpiece of organized chaos. Military police closed civilian roads to all but convoy traffic. Depots were established every 100 miles. Fuel, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, replacement parts, each stockpile large enough to sustain an entire corps for a week. The trucks themselves were engineering marvels in their simplicity. GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo trucks, mass-produced in Detroit. Each one identical, each one repairable with the same set of parts. The Germans, by contrast, relied on dozens of different truck models, many of them requisitioned from occupied countries, each requiring different parts, different training, different maintenance. When a German truck broke down, it stayed broken. When an American truck broke down, a mechanic swapped out the engine in under an hour and sent it back on the road. The drivers of the Red Ball Express lived in a state of perpetual exhaustion. They drove 20-hour shifts, sometimes longer, snatching sleep in the cab between runs. They drove through villages the Germans had rigged with demolition charges, through forests where snipers waited, through roads so pitted by shell fire that the trucks bounced like carnival rides. Accidents were common: rollovers, head-on collisions in the blackout, brake failures on mountain passes. The official records list over 300 drivers killed in action, not from enemy fire, but from the road itself. Yet the convoys never stopped. When a truck went off the road, the convoy pushed it into the ditch and kept moving. When a bridge collapsed, engineers built a pontoon crossing in hours. When the Germans bombed a fuel depot, the flames were still burning when the next convoy arrived to salvage what remained. The Wehrmacht officers who witnessed this, who saw entire divisions sustained by what seemed like black magic, could only stare in disbelief. They had fought the Soviets, who threw human waves at machine guns until the guns jammed from overheating. They had fought the British, who planned every offensive with meticulous care and retreated when the plan failed. But the Americans? The Americans simply overwhelmed problems with resources until the problems ceased to exist. In the winter of 1944, a German panzer officer named Hauptmann Dieter Kessler was captured near Bastogne. During his interrogation, he was offered a cup of coffee and a pack of American cigarettes. He stared at them as if they were artifacts from another planet. The interrogator, a bored lieutenant from Ohio, asked him what he thought of the American army. Kessler chose his words carefully. "You do not fight a war," he said. "You industrialize it." The lieutenant laughed and offered him another cigarette. Kessler took it. He smoked it slowly, savoring the taste of real tobacco, not the oak leaf substitute the Wehrmacht had been issuing since 1943. Then he asked the question that had been gnawing at him since his capture. "Where does it all come from?" The lieutenant shrugged. "Detroit, Pittsburgh, everywhere. We make more than we can use, so we figured we'd share." Kessler did not respond. He was thinking of his own supply officer, a dedicated man who had spent 2 weeks requisitioning horseshoes for a cavalry unit that no longer had horses. He was thinking of the fuel convoys that never arrived, the ration trucks ambushed by partisans, the ammunition depots blown apart by Allied bombers. He was thinking of a war effort that had been grinding itself to dust since Stalingrad, not from lack of courage, but from lack of everything else. And now, sitting in an American prison tent, drinking real coffee, he understood that Germany had never had a chance. The symbolism of the Red Ball Express extended beyond its function. To the GIs marching toward Germany, the sight of those trucks was a promise. You will not be abandoned. To the French villagers lining the roads, it was a spectacle of liberation, proof that the nightmare of occupation was ending. To the Germans, it was a revelation and a nightmare. They had been told by their propaganda that the Americans were soft, that they relied on machines because they lacked the warrior spirit of the Aryan soldier. But here was the truth, laid bare on every muddy road from Cherbourg to the Rhine. The Americans had built an empire of logistics so vast and so efficient that they could wage war on 3 continents simultaneously without breaking stride. The trucks were not a crutch. They were a weapon. Every crate of ammunition delivered meant another German position obliterated. Every gallon of fuel meant another mile gained. Every ration box meant another soldier strong enough to keep fighting. The Wehrmacht had no counter to this. They could not bomb the factories in Detroit. They could not sink the Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic fast enough to matter. They could not ambush enough convoys to slow the advance. The war had become a contest of production, and Germany had lost before the first shot was fired. By the time the Red Ball Express officially ended operations in November 1944, it had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. Its drivers had covered over 48 million miles, enough to circle the Earth nearly 2,000 times. The system was replaced by rail lines and pipelines as the Allies repaired the infrastructure of occupied France, but the legacy endured. The soldiers who had witnessed it, both Allied and Axis, carried the memory forward. For the Americans, it became a symbol of what they could achieve when necessity demanded it, a reminder that logistics and liberty were inseparable. A free society, they understood, was not just one that valued individual rights, it was one that could mobilize collective effort on an unimaginable scale without descending into tyranny. For the Germans, it was a harder lesson. They had worshipped strength in the abstract, the will to power, the triumph of the superior race. But they had neglected the unglamorous work of feeding, fueling, and sustaining an army. They had built tanks that were engineering masterpieces too complex to repair in the field. They had trained soldiers to be fanatical, but had not trained enough mechanics, enough drivers, enough clerks to keep the machine running. They had confused brutality with strength, and in the end, they had been defeated not by a greater brutality, but by a greater competence. The epilogue to the Red Ball Express is written not in battles won, but in roads traveled. Those same highways, repaired and expanded, became the arteries of post-war Europe, carrying not ammunition, but commerce, not soldiers, but families. The drivers who had risked their lives in the blackout returned home to a nation that still did not fully recognize their service. But they had seen something the segregated South could not take away. They had been essential. The trucks themselves, surplus and battered, were sold off and found second lives as farm vehicles, delivery vans, and construction haulers across Europe and Africa, each one a monument to the idea that freedom requires infrastructure. And the Germans, rebuilding from rubble, learned the lesson they had refused to learn in war: that abundance is not a luxury, but a foundation; that a society capable of feeding its people, educating its children, and moving its goods is a society capable of anything. The Red Ball Express was never just about winning a war. It was about demonstrating that democracy, messy and inefficient as it seemed, could marshal resources with a ruthlessness no dictatorship could match. It was a convoy that carried more than supplies. It carried an idea that a nation built on the labor of millions, each contributing their piece, could overcome any tyranny built on the will of one. And as the last truck rolled off the Red Ball route on that November day in 1944, the truth was already clear. The Germans had lost not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they had never understood what they were truly fighting. They had gone to war against an assembly line, and the assembly line had won.